Bye.
Well, let's get more now from Dan Johnson, our correspondent who's in Manchester. And Dan, you're aware we're expecting to hear from Andy Burnham very shortly, the Mayor of Greater Manchester. Now, it looks like there was just £5 million maybe between the two sides that stopped a deal being struck. And government sources this afternoon accusing Andy Burnham as being too proud to make a deal. Interesting to get his reaction to that.
Yes, absolutely. That's what everybody's waiting for. No sign of Andy Burnham himself here yet, although some of Greater Manchester's political leaders are starting to gather. So Richard Leese, the leader of Manchester City Council itself, is here just waiting to address members of the media and some members of the public who've stood around waiting to hear from their local leaders today. There were people outside the library earlier today when that midday deadline came and went without an agreement. And now we wait to find exactly what has gone wrong here. What was the sticking point? There is a suggestion that it may have been a relatively small sum of money, perhaps just £5 million, that was in disagreement here, that couldn't be agreed upon before that midday deadline. And that's why the Community Secretary, Robert Jenrick, as he threatened to do last night, having not reached a deal, has now put the issue back to the Prime Minister. So after Andy Burnham has presumably spoken here in the next few minutes, we are then expecting to hear from the Prime Minister about exactly what his next step is, because the government had said if there wasn't a local agreement, it would impose the Tier 3 restrictions anyway. So we wait to find out if that's going to happen, exactly what form those measures will take. And then the question is, how much support will there be for local people, for local businesses? That is what had been argued over for so long here. For so many days now, these discussions have gone on, trying to put more in place to support the businesses and the workers that will be directly affected if they have to close, and those who may be hit by the knock-on impact of social life here being disrupted, of fewer people being out and about. As you were just hearing there, it's already quieter in Manchester city centre than you would expect, and people here have suffered a lot of disruption, not just in the last few weeks while local measures have been in place, but over the last few months, right back to the start of the original lockdown. And people saying that the support package in place so far, that two-thirds support for most people who are told they won't be able to work because of these measures, they feel just isn't enough, doesn't do enough to cover them. And the big question is, how long will this go on? How much disruption will they face? And how far into the winter will it go? When Tier 3 restrictions were agreed in Liverpool last week, there was a 4-week review period put in so that people knew that in a month's time they would see how the measures were working out, what the effect was, and there would be a chance to review those measures and possibly reduce them if they were having an effect. People in Manchester have wanted to know what the future will look like. Will they be living in this local lockdown potentially for months? And that is what is raising so many questions about livelihoods here. I think the way that this has been drawn out, the bitterness that there's been around these discussions, the suggestion that the government wasn't perhaps negotiating fairly at times and was yesterday accused of exaggerating some of the figures in terms of the pressure on local hospitals in an attempt to try and reach a deal, that has gendered some really bad feeling amongst certain people here in the city, that they now feel like the government is bullying them into these restrictions. And that's something we heard from local leaders in other parts of the north as well. We're just waiting to see exactly what the format of this press conference will be, and exactly who's going to speak and who will get a chance to ask their questions of Andy Burnham and some of the other leaders who are gathering here right now. But the question they're going to face is, how have they not managed to reach a deal? Because everyone accepts this is so serious, there is so much at stake here. There was an agreement that further restrictions were needed in some form, although exactly what those restrictions would be has been one of the arguing points. And yet here we are, that midday deadline having come and gone, and now being on the brink of central government imposing these restrictions on Manchester. And that means essentially that whatever local politicians may have been able to agree beforehand, they now presumably aren't going to have much of a say in what happens next. It will be for government ministers and officials to determine exactly what the restrictions are for this city, what sort of businesses are actually affected and to what degree, and what support there'll be, and how long it may last when those review periods may kick in to look again at the measures to see whether they are being effective. Local politicians, part of their resistance had been that they thought the standard Tier 3 restrictions as laid out by the government weren't actually going to be effective at getting the numbers down in this city. That's been one part of the concern that's been argued over with the government over the last few weeks. But there really has been a lot of bitterness in this discussion that's delayed really the imposition of measures here, and potentially, as the Prime Minister said last week, put further their lives at risk, and there are people who feel that in this city. A man came up to me earlier and said Andy Burnham needs to stop posturing, needs to stand down, needs to accept these measures to protect the lives of people here and make sure that the case numbers don't get even further out of control. But that midday deadline came and went without an agreement. There was then an update on social media, on Robert Jenrick's Twitter feed. The local government secretary said, "I am disappointed that despite recognising the gravity of the situation, the Mayor of Greater Manchester has been unwilling to take the action that is required to get the spread of the virus under control in Greater Manchester and reach an agreement with the government." He said, "I have therefore advised the Prime Minister that these discussions have concluded without an agreement." So the ball now very much in the court of the Prime Minister to determine exactly what the next step is. But imminently we're expecting to hear from Andy Burnham and other local leaders about how this went so wrong.
All right, Dan, for the moment, thanks very much. We're hearing Andy Burnham is running at maybe a few minutes behind schedule. So we'll be back with you and with Andy Burnham as soon as he appears there. Thank you so much. In the meantime, let's talk to our political correspondent.